We're presenting on textile waste. I'm Jenny.
I'm Diana.
I'm Susan. Everyone cares about clothes, but why do we care? I've always had a particular interest in textiles. Throughout high school, I designed and sold multiple pieces of clothing. I would always have leftover fabric and try to make use of what I could. While I used up as much fabric as I could before I disposed of it, I always felt guilty throwing these fabric scraps out. In the past few years, I've discovered the large amount of textiles that are thrown out and taken to landfills. We all have bought clothes from a store. Some people prefer in-person shopping, while others find it more efficient to shop online. Throughout these shopping experiences, have you ever thought about what happens to the clothing that is not sold? Where does it go? Unsold clothing is burned, donated, or ends up sitting in landfills where it creates significant environmental problems. Textile waste is a growing problem across the world and it must be addressed.
So before we begin, we want to explain what textile waste is. Textiles are clothes, footwear, accessories, towels, bedding, drapery, and other similar items. Textile waste refers to materials that are wasted during the manufacturing process and clothes that are discarded after consumer use. So there are two types of textile waste. There's pre-consumer waste, and post-consumer waste. Pre-consumer waste consists of two different types. The first type is raw materials that are cut during the production and manufacturing process. It's estimated that 10 to 30% of fabric is cut away and discarded throughout the cutting process. The second type of pre-consumer waste is dead stock, which is clothes that are produced but are unable to be sold. Post-consumer waste, on the other hand, is clothes that is thrown away after consumer has bought it. Reasons customers may discard their clothes are because the clothes might be out of fashion or damaged. Usually consumers donate or throw away their used textiles.
If we take a closer look at the textile industry, we'll see that textiles are demanded by a large amount of people. In 2018, it was estimated that 17 million tons of textiles were generated, and that in that same year, 11.3 million tons of textiles ended up in landfills. With this great demand and wide variety of function comes several problems with the rapid production and waste of textiles.
So why should we care about textiles? Everyone buys clothes and contributes to the fashion industry, but I don't think people take a lot of time to consider how their actions contribute to textile waste. Studies show that Americans on average throw out 81 pounds of clothes per year per person, and 1 out of 2 people throw their unwanted clothes straight in the trash. It's important to educate ourselves on the impact the fashion industry has on the environment and the impact textile waste has on the environment. Textile waste has a bunch of negative impacts on the environment. Research has shown that 85% of discarded textile waste ends up in a landfill. These textiles can take up to 200 plus years to decompose in landfills, and they emit greenhouse gases while they're at it. The fashion industry in general has a negative impact on the environment, as almost 20% of global wastewater is produced by the fashion industry. According to the UN, it takes almost 8,000 gallons to make 1 pair of jeans. And a 2021 study found that the fashion industry is the planet's 3rd biggest polluter.
If we look in more detail at the environmental effects of textiles in general, we'll see how 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions are caused by clothing and footwear production. Along with that, 0.5 million tons of microfibers are released into oceans every year. The rapid production of textiles is leading to large amounts of waste that is extremely harmful to the oceans and atmosphere. If we look at textile waste management in the past, we'll see how a very small fraction of textiles are recycled. A large fraction, however, ends up in landfills. The lack of textiles recycled has contributed to these environmental impacts greatly. If we forecast the future of textile production, we'll see that this problem is not going away. Textile production is expected to increase at a compound annual growth rate of 4.4% from 2021 to 2028. Textile production is continuously expanding, and without action to combat waste, these environmental problems will continue to grow.
So what is the root cause of this problem? It's fast fashion. Fast fashion has taken over the fashion industry. This practice refers to selling cheap, low-quality clothes that only stay in style for a short period of time. As you can see in the graphic, the number of fashion seasons has changed enormously. Previously, there were between 2 and 4 seasons, obviously summer, fall, winter, and spring, or just winter and summer. And now they're up to 52 seasons in the fashion world, which means a new catalog of clothes is made for each season. As a result of fast fashion, consumers are buying more clothes, but using each article of clothing less. Fast fashion is ultimately the root cause of textile waste as it contributes to the overproduction of clothes, which in and of itself is bad for the environment, and ultimately leads to clothes being thrown away and ending up in landfills. So why does this problem exist? As I mentioned before, consumers are buying more clothes but using them less. It's estimated that an average consumer buys 60% more clothes every year, but each article of clothing is worn 36% fewer compared to 15 years ago. The average total lifespan of a piece of clothing is 5.4 years. And studies show that if you were to wear your clothes longer by just 3 months, you would reduce your carbon and water footprints as well as waste generation by 5 to 10%.
So businesses have failed to solve the problem of textile waste because they themselves have a huge impact on the perpetuation of this problem. And businesses are naturally profit-driven, therefore they lack any incentive to eliminate unnecessary textile production because the nature of fashion trends are constantly changing and things are going in and out of style so quickly. People want to consume more of it, and businesses aren't going to oppose that since the more clothes that are being manufactured, the more options of clothes they have to be sold. And so these fast fashion trends provide companies with more profits than they would otherwise earn. And the fashion industry is huge globally. It's valued at 3 trillion. And there's 3,000 billion textile and garment companies entering the market every day. So there's so much potential money to be made in the fashion industry that there's no inherent reason for businesses to go out of their way to not make that money because they gain a lot through the continuation of the problem. And then the government has also not done a lot to solve this problem as they've imposed little regulation and had little intervention within the market because the government tends to have a more hands-off approach when it comes to dealing with businesses, hence why they have barely dealt with the issue, and they've mostly left the problem up to the consumers. With the US specifically implementing labeling laws and marketing regulation that requires fashion brands to disclose fiber content and country of origin, which leaves it up to the consumer to make a conscious, ethical, and sustainable purchase. And so the buyers are the ones responsible for checking the quality of goods before purchasing. The government has also implemented and promoted recycling programs, but for the most part, these haven't been super successful, seeing as the recycling rate for all textiles was 14.7% in 2018, with 2.5 million tons recycled. And it was estimated that the recycling rate for textiles used in clothing and footwear specifically was only 13%. The overall recycling rate, including textiles, is only 32%. So in general, the recycling program in the US hasn't been super successful, as one might hope, but it's not just a textile issue, but the overall rate is more successful than when you just zoom into the overall textile recycling rate. But the government's focus on recycling keeps the problem directed towards consumers instead of focusing on producers who fuel the problem. And you can see here that the recycling rate versus the landfill rate is really skewed, especially in like 2018, because over 2/3 of textiles ended up in landfills. And you can also see how drastically the generation of textiles has increased since the 60s, going from 1,700 to 17,000. So businesses and governments have both mainly taken to informing consumers and leaving this issue up to them to resolve instead of them actively working to resolve the problem themselves. So there's a lot of recommendations for consumers to do to ensure that textile waste and overconsumption are reduced, like buying clothes made where factories have stricter environmental regulations like the US and the EU, choosing organic and natural fibers that don't require chemicals to be produced, choosing fibers with low water consumption like linen and recycled fibers. But the main selling point is to buy less, buy secondhand, buy better quality, and recycle. And while all of these suggestions are good, it leaves the problem up to consumers to fix. And the problem could be more alleviated with the help of business and government regulation.
Overproduction of clothes and textile waste are two enormous problems the world is currently facing, and while the government and most businesses are not taking a role in curbing the issue, it's not all bad. In fact, some businesses are actually committing to using fabrics and materials that are less harmful for the environment and taking action to combat textile waste. A perfect example of this is Patagonia, who sells good good quality products in the first place, but also has a worn wear program where it repairs used Patagonia products and resells them for a cheaper price. Athleta is another brand who is committed to using recyclable materials in most of its clothing. In addition, the number of secondhand ventures has increased. There's a wide variety of apps and websites people use to sell their used clothes, including Poshmark, Depop, and even Facebook Marketplace. Lastly, TikTok has made thrifting into a trend, which means more and more people are thrifting every day. According to ThredUp, thrifting is now a $28 billion industry that is expected to supersede fast fashion by 2029. There's ample opportunity here for entrepreneurs to solve a social issue and enter a growing market.
To summarize, textile waste has a negative impact on our environment. The overproduction of clothing has contributed to consumers buying clothes more often. This cycle of fast fashion encourages consumers to buy more clothing and wear them less times before disposal. The rapid change in style contributes significantly to consumers buying large amounts of clothing. The problem ultimately lies both in the consumer and producer. The textile production industry is expected to expand in the future, and these environmental problems must be addressed. And then here are our sources, and thank you for listening to our presentation.